All right. Hi there. My name is Sarah Barber of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm here with Susan Woodland, our Director of Collections and Research, and she's going to be answering your questions today about Jewish heritage objects.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome to the Museum of Jewish Heritage and our Facebook Live Q&A about the museum collections. I'm so happy to be with you today. And I wanted to thank you for submitting questions and comments beforehand. I will try and address all of them during the presentation. I'd like to start with a brief history of the museum, a little bit about the museum mission and our collecting scope. And then I'm going to do a short show and tell with a few things from my own family collection that are related to materials in the museum collection, and which hopefully are connected also with objects that you have in your own family items. Because we've been home for what seems like forever, I know a lot of us have been able to find the time to actually go through boxes of photographs and mysterious papers and documents, maybe in other languages, and to actually start to look at some of the family history that we always want to do more of. So I hope that if you are in that phase and you're interested in family history, as well as what we have that's related to that in the collection, I hope that you find this of interest and of help. Doing the research for this presentation made me realize how much more work I still have to do on my own family history. So hopefully I'll have time for that in the near future. But first, the museum. The museum came about after decades of conversations in New York City about establishing a memorial to the Holocaust in New York City, the home of so many Holocaust survivors. In 1949, there was talk about a memorial in Riverside Park in Manhattan. But it wasn't really until the Koch administration in the 70s and 80s that the museum began to become a reality. Koch was a Jewish mayor and had lots of friends in high places. The founders of the museum, who are still active on the board, and Robert Morgenthau, the longtime DA, were very involved in pulling together the funding and the thought process involved in starting a memorial of some sort. In 1982, Koch established the New York Holocaust Memorial Commission. And by 1984, the commission formally established the museum as a living memorial to the Holocaust. By 1986, there was enough funding to hire professional museum staff and to begin collecting objects in earnest. In 1990, after conversations with the Center for Holocaust Studies, which had existed since the 70s in Brooklyn, started by Yafa Eliach, to memorialize Holocaust stories by taping survivors and getting their testimony on audio tape. By 1990, they had thousands of testimonies, and they also had objects that had come from those survivors as well, to whom it was really important that their stories be told, that the greater story of the Holocaust was remembered and would be memorialized for as long as possible. They came with photographs and other documentation of their stories. And those were at the Center for Holocaust Studies as well. So in 1990, it was decided that the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, would be an appropriate and lasting and better funded institution to merge with the Center for Holocaust Studies. And in that way, their collection came to us. In addition to the oral history testimonies, it included photographs, three-dimensional artifacts, documents, film footage, and books and reference materials. So that greatly increased the collections at the museum, and the collecting continued certainly until 1997, when our first building opened with our core collection that many of you may have seen. That was up until last year. And collecting has continued and continues still. Even while working remotely, we're receiving email inquiries from people wanting to make donations. There is still a lot of material out there, that needs to find a proper home. Today, the collection includes very broadly 2 different areas of collecting: Jewish heritage items, which might include marriage contracts, charity boxes, report cards from Jewish schools, pre-war immigration documents, and naturalization papers, ritual objects like Torah scrolls and prayer books and Kiddush cups and Sabbath candle holders, all of the things that we use in our daily lives, and in commemorating, in observing Jewish tradition. The other area that we collect really as extensively as possible is Holocaust-related material, like documents imposed upon Jews by the Nazis, items made or used in ghettos, in camps, concentration camps, in hiding, or in DP camps, and post-war immigration and naturalization documentation, which really helps tell the story of the travel that people took to get to a safe and lasting home. The museum's mission is based on the fact that the collections serve as the basis for educational exhibitions and programs and other educational products. Our education department is very active with curriculum that they've written that is used in many public schools and in yeshivas across the greater New York metropolitan area. Education is a huge part of our mission, and it's all based on the collections, as are the exhibitions. We collect material that is connected to the story of a particular person or family who used or created or is otherwise associated with that material. As much as possible, we write down the family story when people come in to donate objects that they've kept as a part of their lives for a long time, and are looking for a safer place for them, and a place that will be able to exhibit and make them accessible to an audience outside of their own family. So we take that story and we use that to make the object relevant. It's not just, it's not just a candle holder. It's a candle holder that was used by this person, by this family, in this specific place and time. And this is what happened to that person. They came to the United States and they had a family, or they had, horrible experiences during the Holocaust, but survived, and the candle holder survived. And when you make this content and this context available to people when they are studying an object or looking at an object in an exhibition that's telling a story, each item represents the person who used it, who owned it, who had it, who kept it safe for a long time. And it becomes much more than just, a candle holder that you could, purchase somewhere or find somewhere. It represents a real living story, a real living person. And that's what's so important to us as we create exhibitions around these objects. We can tell those stories, and that's, the memorial that we are mandated to maintain. So with that explanation of the collections, I just want to show you a few things from my own personal collection. So this is the settlement cookbook, the Way to a Man's Heart. Many of you hopefully have this in your family materials. This was my mom's book. She got it around the time she was married, and she may have very well taught herself to cook from it because her mother didn't cook. One thing that I find really interesting about it is just leafing through the index. I always thought this was a specifically Jewish cookbook. It was created by people who are connected with a settlement house in Milwaukee in 1901. And we'll get into more detail about that when we look at the item in the collection, the settlement cookbook in the collection. But it's interesting to look at what is listed in the index. There's very specifically Jewish things in here. There's kuchen and there's kasha and kishka and kipfel and all of that good stuff. I love the K's. Under Passover, there's pages of Passover recipes. But there's also under S, there's a very long listing on shellfish. 7 or 8 pages in the cookbook are devoted to shellfish, and the index indicates see also crab, lobster, oysters, and shrimp. So it's not a kosher book, but in many Jewish homes it was a real basic cookbook. I love that artifact. Another thing that I've got from my family is a giant, heavy samovar that my great-grandmother brought with her from Russia at the end of the 19th century. She and her family settled in West Philadelphia, which is where my grandmother was born. And I'm sure that my great-grandmother used it. I don't think anybody has used it since, but my grandmother inherited it and gave it to my mother. And so now I have it. And I wish I knew more about it, but I didn't know my great-grandmother. And there's a little bit of information in the catalog record of the samovar that I will show you in a minute from the collection. That is general in nature and, will tell us all things about our own samovars. Another object that I have is my great-grandfather's passport. My great-grandfather came from Russia, and this is on the other side of the family. He came, but around the same time in the 1890s. And this is actually an American passport. So after he had been in the United States for several decades, he became a naturalized citizen. He earned enough money as a peddler to open his own store and had enough money by 1922 when he got this passport to take his wife and his youngest daughter, who was a teenager, on a grand tour around Europe and to Palestine. So it's one of these, 1920s era gigantic open up to one huge document that has visas and signatures and stamps and photographs of my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother in it. So that's great. And many of you may have those passports that tells so much. First of all, gives his age, gives his height, where he's from, although it's very non-specific. It just says Russia, date of birth. So all of that is good. Occupation, merchant. And it also says where they travel to, or where they were intending to get visas to travel to: Poland, British Isles, France, Holland, Hungary, Egypt, Constantinople, Belgium, Switzerland, Italy, Palestine, Greece, Austria, and Germany. It's amazing. And now we don't get stamped so much in our passports, so we don't have those fabulous documents. But his name was H.S. Pekin, and here he is in a family photograph from around the same time. It's about 1922, either before or after the trip. And he is right here. That's H.S. and that's his wife. And that's my Aunt Betty, his youngest daughter. And in front of him is the real matriarch of the family. That's his mother, my father's great-grandmother, who he knew. She came from Russia, I assume at the same time, and had a store in Reading, Pennsylvania. And she died at 103. She was an amazing woman. I'm sorry I never met her. And the owner of the samovar is my grandmother Annie, who's here, who lived in West Philly. And this is her family at the time. There were still a couple more children to be born. This is my grandmother Eva. And that's a couple years after the turn of the 20th century. And the object that I have left is my little tiny mortar and pestle, which is remarkably almost identical, except in size, to the one in the photograph in the announcement, which is from the collection. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that, and we'll talk about the people who wrote in really great comments and a couple of questions about mortars and pestles. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch to a PowerPoint, and we'll start looking at some items from the collection. Okay, so there's the mortar and pestle from our collection. There's my little one. Same handles. It's really funny. I'm going to start with the broad area of collecting that I call Jewish heritage items. And in the background, you can just barely see this photograph of pre-war Luxembourg, a very well-to-do family, the Klein family, in maybe their dining room, maybe their living room, lots of flowers, a really wonderful pre-war life. But first I'm going to go here to the settlement cookbook, which initially, this is the second edition. It's from 1903. It was first published in 1901, written by Mrs. Simon Kander and Mrs. Henry Schoenfeld, who, as was popular at the time, did not have first names. And it was actually called The Way to a Man's Heart, the settlement cookbook. And it says Milwaukee, Wisconsin on the cover. So it was Mrs. Kander taught cooking at the settlement house in Milwaukee. Volunteers there, according to the record in our catalog, gave her the recipes for the book, and she sold 1,000 copies of the first edition. And as far as I know, editions were published through 1968. My mother's edition is it's a little newer looking, a little bit in design, is from 1949. The settlement movement, you may be aware, began in the late 19th century. There were reform institutions where settlement workers provided services to remedy conditions of poverty. Well-known settlement houses include Hull House, started by Jane Addams in Chicago, which is now a wonderful history location. Right in the same house. There's a wonderful tour there. And the Henry Street settlement, started by Lillian Wald on the Lower East Side of New York, which is still an extremely active and important social and cultural fixture in the Lower East Side neighborhood, which has remained an immigrant neighborhood to some extent. You know, it's gentrifying like everything else, but there's still a need for a contemporary version of settlement houses. Here is one of the samovars in our collection. I'm sorry, this is a black and white photo. That's all that was accessible remotely. It says it's from Poland, but it looks very similar to my great-grandmother's. Nickel, silver, wood, and brass. The silver may be the part where the tea or hot water comes out of. But most of it is probably brass, and the wood is on the handles. This samovar was used for Passover by the donor's uncle. And here's the mortar and pestle. Very much like that, right? It was brought to the United States by Sarah Melser Bressler in 1922. She came from the Soviet Union in a part that is now Ukraine. Rachel wrote into us and asked for more information on this specific mortar and pestle. This is most of the information that we have access to remotely. That's in our online catalog. Although the online catalog is only accessible to staff at this moment, we're working as hard as we can to make all of our collection material accessible online, and that will happen, one day in the future, hopefully sooner rather than later. Rachel wanted to know how we were able to date it. Now, we haven't dated the mortar and pestle itself, but because it was brought by Sarah, it's at least that old, and it may be much older. I don't know how old Sarah was in 1922. I believe the record said she died in 39, so she could have already been in her 60s or 70s by 1922. So she might have had it a very long time. She might have inherited it from her mother. There may be information in our paper file on this donation, which we don't have access to right now, but we will have access to when we go back to the museum. So Rachel or anyone, if you're interested in additional information, I will have contact information at the end of the presentation. So please let me know if you'd like anything specific about any of the objects that you see. And this was donated by the grandson of Sarah's grandson. Here is a different kind of passport. It's in a booklet. It's an Austrian passport issued in Poland in 1916 to Adele Gerstenhaber, who, one small part of her story is that during World War I, 1916, she abandoned her two small children and followed her husband in his war travels. I'm assuming he was not at the front. He may have been an officer or something, but she was able to earn extra leave for her husband by sewing shirts for the officers. It's really kind of an interesting story. I'm sure there's much more to it, hopefully in the paper file. This is the Weiss family in Czechoslovakia in 1922. It's a wonderful record of, pre-war Czechoslovakia family. Again, there may be more information about this family or members of the family. Someone somehow the photograph survived. So you can only hope that, you know, the next year everyone left. We have this issue every time we go through items in the catalog. You know, you want to learn about someone's story, but you really don't want to learn too much sometimes. That's the nature of a Holocaust museum. This is a photograph I just really wanted to include. We have so many family photographs. This one, despite the slightly greenish tinge, is a wonderful record of this family that looks so happy and kind. They just look like they all get along. Now, it could be posed, but they're obviously in a studio. You know, it's got a painted backdrop, and the mom's a little stiff. But the little girl on the right, she's like a little imp, and she's got this little smile coming, and she's holding on to her father's arm in such a sweet way. Her older sister over here in the center is just about to smile as well. And the little brother is holding his mother's hand, his sister's hand. It's hard to tell, but it's just a delightful photograph. They look like really nice people. That's the Glaser family from Vienna in the late 20s. And then we get to more Holocaust-related documents and objects. This is a document, correspondence from the American consul in Warsaw. Shortly after the war, a year after the war was over, 1946, to Solomon Gutfreund, who was in New York by that time. And I tried to blow this up. It's a bit blurry, but he's responding to a letter from Solomon Gutfreund, inquiring about circumstances surrounding the death of his wife. So it sounds like Solomon already knew that his wife did not survive, Gazella Gutfreund, and he's still looking for information about his son, Naphtali Gutfreund. So hopefully he was able to find information soon about his son and more details about his wife. There were many organizations you may be well aware of who were working to help people locate their relatives and friends and people from their hometown in the post-war years. It was so much harder than it is today to find people. It's very hard to hide right now, I think. People are so easily accessible online. But there were organizations like the International Tracing Service, which still exists, and the Red Cross, the International Red Cross, the American Red Cross, the Red Cross, and related organizations. There were Jewish refugee organizations like the Joint Distribution Committee, and HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. Both of those organizations are still in existence today, doing good work with refugees everywhere. And they were all trying to centralize the data. You know, if somebody inquired about someone specific, that question, you know, would go to a centralized place so that if there was information, they would be able to find it. And in the archives of organizations like the Joint, they have their own extensive archive where it's possible to do all kinds of family history and find information. Many, many lists, you know, from DP camps and information like that. HIAS records are in two places, in the YIVO archives at the Center for Jewish History in New York, and from the pre-war period, the war years and the immediate post-war period, those are at YIVO, and records from a little bit later, but including some post-war information. There are very interesting records in the HIAS collection at the American Jewish Historical Society, also at the Center for Jewish History. Some of that information, certainly guides to collections, are accessible online for all of those collections. And you'll see those agencies, some of them mentioned in some of our documentation here, and certainly elsewhere in our collection. Now, I wanted to address a comment that Linda made a couple of days ago about a document, not a Polish document, but a document in a frame that she found in her aunt's apartment. She said her aunt was a German Jew and she escaped to the US. But her aunt had it, so I assume it's in German. And I could see the frame. It's in a very, fancy frame. The fact that her aunt kept it and kept it in a frame and kept it out meant that it was very important to her. And I don't know if Linda has been able to have it translated, but I'm guessing that you may have a question about how to get things translated, like where to find a translator. So on the next slide, I have a little bit of information about that. But this document is written on the back of a postcard, 1940, July 14th. You can see the format that dates were written in, with the month in the center in Roman numerals and then the date on the left. It's very consistent that way for many years. The translation, the only thing is our life a bit, we will be most grateful. And then towards the bottom, my dears, I would like to receive news from you as soon as possible. I am very happy that after a long separation, Felek is again with us. Please do whatever you can for us. You can only imagine that by 1940, the writer of this postcard, who looks like Felek, I'm guessing that Felek was married to Maricia, and he may have been deported for a short while and returned home. But they're concerned about leaving, and they're looking to relatives wherever they are. These relatives were in the United States. Please help us. So that's a very important document from the Eisner family. Here's a note on translators, and this is geared specifically if you're looking for a translator for material that's in German. I think a great place to go. We don't have a good translator of German right now, someone who can either volunteer, preferably volunteer for us. We have people who can sound things out, but to translate an entire document that's in German and handwritten German and old-fashioned handwritten German, it's difficult, but it's a great challenge for students. And I'm thinking that that students of German at NYU, that you can probably contact through Deutsche Haus there. And I found these just by Googling. Someone there might be interested in doing some translation, earning a little extra money. Other places you could go are the Leo Baeck Institute, the Genealogy Institute at the Center of Jewish History. I've got 2 links there. Or the Goethe Institute. Some of them may have lists of, I know the center maintains a list of translators. I know that a lot of translators do not want to translate too many handwritten documents. It must be really exhausting. So these links will all be posted on social media later, so you don't need to write it down right now or worry about losing it. You'll be able to get that later, or you can certainly contact me later for that. Here's a different kind of passport. This is from Alfred Israel Wertheim. You can see very clearly the big red J for Jew, issued in Germany in 1939. Alfred was a merchant who traveled internationally for work, and so he had a passport. And he was able to get to, I don't know his whole story, but he survived the war in Shanghai. So he was able to get out in time and to find a safe place to run out the war. And it was donated by his estate. Another passport. Passports are just so full of information. They're wonderful documents. Plus, they often have pictures. This is Lithuanian passport, 1940. I included this because it contains a Sugihara visa. Some of you may have heard of Sugihara. He was the Japanese consul in Kaunas, Lithuania at this time. And when he saw just crowds and crowds of Jewish refugees from Lithuania, but also from many other countries, just desperate for a way out of where they were, out of Lithuania, somewhere that felt safer. And so he felt like all he could do was issue visas. And he was given explicit instructions on how many he could issue by the Japanese government. And he stretched those rules. You know, if he could issue 100, he decided, okay, I'm not going to do 100 people, I'm going to do 100 families. And so all their children would get out on one, official visa. He did what he could until he was actually removed from his post. And his career never really recovered from this. But he has been honored in many ways by Israel and Yad Vashem, and his son has spoken at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. It's a very, very moving story that he did what he could. This is a wonderful item. I assume it's a very rare type of item. It's a spice box of the family of Rabbi Zev Wolf Rosenberg from Hungary. And you can read in the description, it's a small urn, the cover is missing, it's dented along the sides. Family members flattened this box to be easier to hide when they were deported from Hungary to Dorf and later to the Terezin ghetto in Czechoslovakia. It was hammered out again after the war. The donor, Judith Thaler, is a descendant of the rabbi. So that's a really unique story and such an exhibitable object. It's three-dimensional and it has a very moving story and an amazing story of survival. And now I want to talk a little bit about displaced persons camp materials based on a question from Will. Will wanted to know what the museum collections contain that relate to DP camps, what type of materials, and how we interpret, remember, and memorialize the lives of the Jewish DPs, and the times, what the times were like during that era of immediate post-war. So I have a number of items pictured coming up, but in general, our collection includes several hundred items relating to displaced persons camps and the displaced persons themselves. There are many oral history testimonies that include parts of their DP camp experiences. There are institutional records and family history documentation. Items have been donated by survivors or their relatives, American GIs, and military chaplains. I didn't realize how much information until I've gone in and really done like some serious searching in our catalog for this kind of material, how involved the chaplains were with documenting things and even their own service in the DP camps, which gives a very interesting perspective on the kind of life that that people lived sometimes for quite a number of years in the DP camps. Formats are varied. We have artifacts, photographs, personal documents. We have, as far as I can tell, one film that is from a DP camp, and the oral histories are just very, very rich in terms of what they include. I'm just looking at my note here. The film is from the Zeilsheim DP camp. And the institutions connected with the administration of the DP camps also have information, like some of the photographs were taken by the US Army, things like that in our collection. So the joint is definitely involved in some of the material, related to some of the material, the US Army, and UNRWA, the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. All of them were very involved. This is just a really nice document. It's a flyer announcing a concert that was conducted by Leonard Bernstein. I don't know if any of you saw the Bernstein exhibition at the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia about 2 years ago. But that included photographs and maybe some video of Bernstein conducting concerts in DP camps after the war. It was very, very moving, very important to survivors, and probably the people who were working there, and I'm sure to the American Joint Distribution Committee staff that was in the U.S. zone of occupation. But this is a flyer for 2 concerts on May 10th, 1948. So that would have been 3 years after the liberation or the end of the war. And one was at Feldafing in the afternoon, and the other was in Landesberg in the evening of that day. And the concert was sponsored by the American Joint Distribution Committee. It's, I don't have a picture of the back, but on the back, there's a note to, I think the father of the donor, Mr. Gurko, or Mr. Dermashkin, I think. So it must have been her father who was there. And I don't have the other information about that, but we have that in the catalog. And I'm sure there's plenty of information in the donor file on paper. This is a family photograph that took place in the Schlachtensee displaced persons camp in Berlin, sometime during the 5 years that this family was there. This little girl was probably born there. And it was donated by either, not by Rivka, but maybe by Rivka's brother, niece. I'm not sure. That information is in the catalog record, so we maintain that. This is it's an ID card. It's a work card for students. And it was a vocational school in Egenfelden, DP camp, that was run by ORT, which I assume is related to the women's organization that we know in the United States now. I assume it's the same ORT, because they've always been involved with vocational education. So there's a little bit of information here. It has his picture on it. And it has, documentation that he was at this school and he was at this camp. And so it helps a little bit to document where Isaac Arbus was when in his journey after the war. And this is a long time after the war. It's more than 2 years. And it was given to us by Isaac Arbus himself. This is a picture of Christina. I'm not going to pronounce her last name. She's at the Kloster Indersdorf Children's Home in 1945. So she was a survivor. But after liberation, she and a lot of other children had no family with them for whatever reason, however that happened. They may have moved around by themselves. They may have been separated from their parents or other relatives. It's unclear. And some of them, she's a little bit older, but some of them are so young that they don't remember. They didn't remember their names. They didn't remember anything about their family, or they couldn't give, where they were from. So this is a very large collection that was given to us by Robert Marx, the son of Andre Marx, who worked for UNRWA again, that was administering this children's home that was based in a former convent near Dachau in Germany, immediately after the war, as they located children who seemed to have no friends or relatives with them. And attempts were made for a long time to try and find their relatives. And one attempt was to take these pictures. There's a picture of each one of many children in our collection. I don't know how many children were actually at the children's home through the years that it was open, but there are many, many photographs of these kids. Some of them are so tiny that they can't even hold the sign with their name on it. So it's sitting next to them. And this man, Andre Marx, he was a social worker, and he was director of the children's home for at least part of the time that it was open. And while the search was going on for family members that the children could rejoin, he recreated a Jewish life for the orphans. And we have documentation from the same collection, from Andre himself, of celebrating holidays. There's a handwritten, handmade Passover Haggadah that they used at least 1 year, that the children could use for their own Seder. And there are just other photographs and documents that that show us, that the kids had as much of a, like a normal life now that the war was over, with other Jewish kids in what was probably kind of a grand home in this former convent. So the record does indicate that many of the children were sent to Palestine. They may have been part of the Youth Aliyah movement, because by this time after the war, there were many youth villages that were set up for children that made it to Palestine in any number of ways, or after 48 to Israel, but they were without families. And so Israel was set up from before it was a state to bring in these kids and raise them as Jewish kids, to give them kosher observant homes if that's where they came from, to give them a home on a kibbutz if that was the kind of family they seemed to be from. And so that may be where some of these children ended up. The museum held an exhibition in 2017 to 2018 with the name "My Name is the Lost Children of Kloster Indersdorf." And there is quite a bit of information about that exhibition on our website, which I encourage you to take a look at. It's really, it's very moving. And the catalog from the exhibition, with many, many, many pages of these children's photographs. They're just amazing, amazing, beautiful pictures of these kids. Look at her dimples, and she's in a nice sweater with curly hair. It's really, it's just, it's a very sweet exhibition. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And with that, I am going to move to some resources and some links. We received a question from, let's see, a question from Anne about a Megillah Esther that she inherited from her great-great-grandfather that needs conservation work. And so I think the best way to start to find information is to go to one of the two centers, conservation centers that I've listed here, the Northeast Document Conservation Center, NEDCC, which is located north of Boston. They have a huge amount of information on their website about mostly paper, but also other objects and family collections. And if there isn't information about how to locate a conservator in your area, and you can certainly contact them. They're full of information. They're always giving talks and presentations. Another center that's similar is the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts located in Philadelphia. They also have a very informative website. To reach a conservator directly that would know something about Jewish religious items, I think you might want to contact someone either at Yeshiva University. I believe they have a conservator on staff through the library and archives, or at the Jewish Theological Seminary or the Jewish Museum, all in New York. And they might be very helpful about your questions about the kashrut condition, since some of the letters are faded, and the fact that you have already spoken and with a scribe is very helpful. Obviously, I can't speak to how to make it kosher or what to do. If there is anything that you can do with this kind of Megillah, but the conservators at those institutions in New York would definitely have information for you, and maybe leads to conservators who would be able to talk to you about doing some work. So that's conservation. And conservation, of course, people specialize in textiles or paper or three-dimensional objects very specifically, because they study the chemistry of materials and all of that. So it's important, obviously, to find the right person to handle your materials. Yizzy had written in asking for how to care for her objects, and a basic introduction and resources on how to work with the family collection. So I have not read Creating Family Archives, but it was just published last year by the Society of American Archivists, the professional association that I belong to as a trained archivist. And there's a preview, which is very well written. And it's the whole introduction that tells you the whole scope of what's covered in this. And it's basically everything that you need to know, how to handle physically your material, and how to go about doing research and learning more about anything that you have in your collection. But the care of the materials, do you put something in an acid-free folder, which is what I keep this passport in. It could be in a Mylar sleeve. I don't happen to have any Mylar sleeves. They're really expensive. I need to buy some Mylar sleeves, but I buy acid-free paper. You can't see it, but there's a watermark in it. So, and the folder is acid-free, and there's a very long tab that I haven't written anything on yet, but that's what you can put in a box, an acid-free box. So all of that information and resources of where you can buy acid-free supplies would be in there. So I think I've got one more page. We will be posting all the links on social media. Sarah's going to take care of all of that very soon. For additional information about the museum collections, please check our webpage. There are FAQs there and links to a couple of things. We hope in the near future, you know, when we can, that there will be a day in the very near future when we have all of our collections accessible publicly online. That's our immediate goal, after getting back to the museum physically. And for any additional questions, please feel free to contact me at collections@mjh.org. And I am going to stop sharing and go back and hear Sarah. And that's what I have to tell you today.
Thank you so much, Susan, for your time. It was a wonderful presentation. We got a lot of positive feedback, and thank you so much for joining us today.